Cool. Hey, thank you very much, everybody, for joining. As you can see, I have an agenda on screen. We'll tell you a little bit about how we propose to run this webinar, give a bit of an overview of the rebate, and then what we're keen to get into are hear your discussions and your comments about the draft consultation document that has been put out. And really, I think some of our key goals today are for you all to become familiar with the Game Development Sector Rebate and what's in the current proposed design features, and that you've had the opportunity to think about how it affects you, your game studio, your business, because there may be some suggestions and some questions that people raise today that you haven't thought about how that impacts you yet. And then MB, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, have a consultation process where they want to hear from us, and the deadline for that is the 6th of July. So we're keen for everybody here to share, and to participate in that submission process, so that all together collectively we design a rebate that works to grow our entire sector. The people who are on the call today, I will be your facilitator, and we're pleased that we've got, goodness, about 67 people joining this web call who are NZGDA members and friends. We have some of the NZGDA board members here. So Chelsea Rapp, our chairperson, myself, Lance. In particular, we've been involved in conversations with MB both last year and also more recently, since the rebate was actually announced a little bit over a month ago. Lance, it's also worthwhile pointing out, is a chartered accountant, so brings some accounting and finance expertise to the team. We also have present V. Prendergast, who is the operations manager at the NZ Centre of Digital Excellence. Now, Code does not have an official role in this scheme, but V has a background in designing similar schemes in Australia. So she has expertise to contribute to the process and lessons that we've been able to learn from Australian and other international schemes which have been similar. We have some officials listening in, but maybe also answering some of our questions today from government. So Sarah and Lucas from the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, and from their digital economy team. So they're responsible for a whole range of policy to grow the digital economy in New Zealand. And MB are the government department who have the budget for this. It falls into a bigger picture strategy that they have called the Digital Technologies Industry Transformation Plan, and they're the government agency responsible for designing the scheme and the policy around it. But we also have with us Amy Mills, who is the head of funding from New Zealand On Air, and New Zealand On Air's role is not to design the policy, but they will help administer it. New Zealand On Air administer large amounts of public funding for media agencies, media companies, including video games. So they've got those systems for the delivery and the administration of the fund. Also a shout out, Amy spoke at NZGDC a few years ago, and NZ On Air. Separately, a few months ago, we had a webinar about the funding that NZ On Air do provide for games in some cases. And just again, that's completely separate from this rebate and the scheme that we're talking about today. So, as I said, we want to get your feedback and answer your questions. Thank you for everybody who's already posted in the chat. Everybody's currently on mute by default when you join this call, but I'm keen to hear your voices as well. So what we're going to do is essentially work through the consultation document in order. And I will attempt to give you a bit of a heads up a few seconds in advance, because I'd like you to actually read out your question. Try to keep it short. We already only have 50 minutes left to discuss this today, and there's an awful lot to go through. We're up for questions, but also during the feedback process, we're up for suggestions on how to clarify things, how to make things clearer. Any comments or observations about how it affects your business as well, because the team from both the NZGDA and government are here to learn about the impact of this rebate on your business and will it actually make a difference. It's entirely possible that today may be more about questions than answers, and that's okay. The submission process and writing a submission might be the best place to make a proposal or a suggestion about how a question could be answered. So we don't expect we'll resolve everything in the 40, 50 minutes we have left today. and we'll continue to discuss this online, both on the NZ Game Developer Slack channel and also in emails from the NZGDA to all of our members. So I posted in the Slack, in the chat, already some links. We are going to assume that you have already read the consultation document at the mb.gov.nz URL. So if not, quickly start reading. On the nzga.com, we've posted a few FAQ. We can discuss it online. We want to discuss it at this webinar. The NZGDA will also prepare our own submission, and we'll try to share that prior to the 6th of July, so you can also give us feedback on it as well and say whether you agree or disagree, which you are quite welcome to. So that's what we'll do following today's webinar. I'm going to launch into it. I'm going to ask Chelsea Rapp, the chairperson of the NZGDA, just to give a bit of an overview of both how we got there here and also overview of the scheme itself.
Hi, everyone. I apologize. I am getting over a cold, so please excuse that. And I'm going to go really fast because I know that we just kind of want to get to the meat of why we're all here. Just for a bit of background, this is something that the NZGDA has been lobbying for since really before 2019, but really started in earnest in 2019 as a part of the interactive Aotearoa report. We really kicked that up last year and this year as well, very much supported by all of our game studios, but also a lot of allies in business, government, and in education. And it's important to remember that this initiative is a part of a sort of sweeping package of initiatives that are called the Digital Industries Transformation Plan. It's also where the funding for Taking Code National was included and is really in response to the Australian scheme. Just as a high-level overview, it's going to be $40 million per annum for both delivery and administration, which is going to be administered by NZ On Air. It includes a rebate for qualifying expenditures, which we'll try to talk about shortly, and of eligible firms at a rate of 20%. It's currently capped at $3 million per annum per eligible business, and the minimum qualifying expenditure is $250,000. It's also important to note that it's effective as of April 1st this year.
And I should add, in the conversations that the NZGA had with MB last year, there's a few things that we suggested that we thought were good ideas that have already been adopted. So for instance, and there are things that make this scheme different from how, say, the Australian scheme is run or how even some of the film schemes are run. So for instance, the fact that it's per annum is different and better than some schemes around the world. The fact that it's based on your business rather than an individual project avoids questions like, when is your game complete? Which is possibly no longer a relevant question in the era of live service games and constantly updating games. And I think we're also really pleased that that minimum qualifying expenditure is $250,000. In Australia, it's $500,000 Australian dollars. And previously, when other schemes around the world, it's much higher. So we're pleased that this could support smaller sized growing studios as well as large established ones. So there's already some feedback that the government took on board before we even got to this stage. Okay, I'm going to start going through the document. The eligible businesses section. Good news, I'm not going to read this all out verbatim because we're assuming you have read it. Key requirement is that the business is a New Zealand business because the intention of the rebate is to encourage economic development, economic activity in New Zealand. However, I saw Anthony had a good question. Anthony Blackett had a good question about the business primarily being involved in developing digital games. Do you want to unmute yourself and just share that question, Anthony?
Sure. Yeah, so my question is, does a company, do they have to fulfill all of those components of building a game, which are listed as the content, the game mechanics and code, and the player participation? Or can they only develop a subset of that? Say, if you're an art outsourcing company, do you also qualify because you're only building the art for a game, not a complete game?
Yeah. And that's a good example because your studio is Cinti Studios, who are well known for making
we make
art
video
assets,
game assets
and other assets too. Fantastic. Yeah. And I see a few other people have asked similar questions to this. Does anyone anyone else wants to speak to this or respond to this? I'm thinking either Sarah or V. I think, look, you were part. Yeah, go V.
Sorry, Stephen. Yeah, no, we raised this in the initial consultation chat the other day, the other week, and Sarah was confident that that would meet as part of the definition. I mean, keep in mind that this is still fluid and it might require a little bit more verbiage to facilitate it specifically, but that's obviously part of this process.
Yeah. So I think it's an excellent example of an edge case that we need to think about. I don't think the current criteria rule it out or exclude it, but I think it is something that the intention of the scheme is to include art outsourcing teams. There was one or two other people about the 75%. Stephen Nicholas, do you want to ask your question?
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, just curious about that 3-year criteria. Does it exclude startups and basically pre-revenue studios? Because obviously they won't have 3 years of history being over that 75% threshold.
Yep.
And also just whether grants and milestone payments would be included or excluded from that calculation.
Cool. Actually, Sarah, are you okay to briefly answer this one? I believe I asked you it the other week as well.
Yeah, hi everyone. So basically, the idea of the 75% average over 3 years is we don't want you to take the average over the last 10 years. If you're going to go backwards, just go up to 3. So it's not ruling out a company that's only been in existence for 2 years or as a startup, as long as you meet the other criteria. And I'm sorry, I missed the second half of your question. If you wouldn't mind repeating, please.
Well, sorry, it was just about some studios get grants or milestone payments for development of games and whether they'd be included in that calculation of revenue.
I see V shaking her head.
No, it's actually stated elsewhere in the document. So if you get a code grant, so you can get 190,000 through a code, you know, in theory, in that pre-revenue phase, you can't count that because that's already government money that you're getting, and so you can't get a double dip and get a rebate off that. And I'd also note that that's a really standard feature across all these schemes across this region.
Yep, thanks.
Cool. And I've had a question that somebody else submitted offline, which was, let's say I'm a digital ad agency, but I'm getting into the games industry, but I don't yet have 75% of my business. Couldn't I just set up a subsidiary company that's 100% game development and get around this? Isn't it an easy loophole to exploit? So I don't know if anyone has any views on that. I suppose you can see the intent here is to avoid the scheme being exploited by things that are just obviously not game development.
I think, just speaking to my view on that, like, yeah, obviously with the lower end cap, even if you did set up a separate thing, you'd kind of want to meet that minimum threshold anyway. So I don't know if there's a hell of a lot to be gained by doing that. So it kind of just wants to ensure that you are of substance, you are of scale, and your primary focus is digital games development. So I think even if you did things like that, set up subsidiaries, essentially you'd still have to meet the same those kind of criteria.
Yeah. So to summarize what you're saying, because after the eligible business check, there's the eligible games check, and then the eligible expenditure check. They also act as checks. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that, Tyrone. Now I'm not going to have the ability to answer to go through every single question today for this section. So that's an apology to Ryan, but what we will do is we'll make sure that we document every question that has been posted into the chat today. So we do consider them as well. But for the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving through the document to the next section.
Stephen, sorry, can I just interrupt? I just got a message. There's a couple people still in the waiting room.
Yep. They are here now. Welcome.
Cool. Thanks, mate. Appreciate that.
Thank you for that. Welcome everybody who has just joined us from the waiting room. If you have burning questions, please post them in the chat, and we may call of you as we talk through the document. Cool. Okay, what makes an eligible game? not proposing to go into the detailed debate of defining a game or not on this call, but I know there are a few questions around some of the GDSR will not apply to expenditure on digital games that are, there's a series of bullet points there. So one question we've had already is around the first bullet point about not apply to gambling services or substantially comprised of gambling or gambling-like practices. Footnote, this includes loot boxes or similar game mechanics. Who had a question about this or wanted to ask about this?
I did.
Yeah, go Alroy.
Yeah, so earlier the government, I don't know how many years ago, but they stated that loot boxes are not considered gambling. But here it is saying gambling is, loot boxes are considered gambling. So there's a bit of a contradiction here. And I wonder if the government has changed its mind, because that could be problematic because obviously the government needs to, because it depends whether or not a judge thinks that this abrogates the previous law, because I don't know that much about the New Zealand legal system, but I guess some judges may view it as, or some might not. And well, obviously you don't want a problem there, right?
Yep. And building on that, look, the last time I saw any guidance from the Department of Internal Affairs, they said, yes, we do not consider loot boxes gambling. And also the Department of Internal Affairs is beginning a process to review how they regulate online content in the next few years as well. Did anyone else want to talk about this or comment about the impact of it? Like, are there studios out there who make loot boxes or something that's a bit like a loot box, but it's not actually gambling in your own games?
We have used loot boxes before.
Yeah.
But
Thanks, Sam.
also the wording similar game mechanics is extremely vague.
Yep. And look, an example someone's that I've heard of, for instance, are many Pokemon games for children, or high-profile mainstream games, say like FIFA, have mechanics in them that are similar to loot boxes or loot box-like. Okay. Hey, look, so I think this is an area that, look, we've already heard loud and clear from many people, just that loot boxes as a hard thing to define, and the main bullet point, gambling service or substantially comprised of gambling. I think the word substantially comprised of is trying to set a clear bar for it, and the fact that there's actually lots of gray areas and random things are a common element of games. So I think, look, this is an area that people should certainly make submissions about and if you have suggestions on, and I think it's certainly one that the NZGDA will put some thought into and put into our own submission. Tyrone, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, like obviously, Stephen, we've had some discussion around this, as have some other people in the industry. And you're right, like at the very kind of standard end of loot boxes, you've got things like randomization. And as we know, games pretty much can't function without randomization. Our game, Rival Stars Horse Racing, has this kind of genetic breeding algorithm, but at the end of the day, it's kind of some randomization as to what horses you get at the other side of it. So is that a loot box? And then you kind of get to the other side, which I'm sure a lot of people agree is more the dark art, dark practice of, okay, well, we have compu gacha type things where you need to collect gacha with extremely high rarities and then complete sets of things on extremely high rarities, which was banned in Japan, for example, that specific form of gacha and loot boxes. But then there's also the ability to extract money out of the economy. So that leans much more heavily into what I think a lot of people would expect from gambling, but there's a whole spectrum of that in between and plenty of examples. So I think getting clarity on where that line sits makes a lot of sense. I think the government is kind of being practical, or at least MD's being practical around how they define that. There are examples of how to more clearly define this in other jurisdictions, like Austria, I believe, has a slightly more refined description, and there might be opportunities for us to look to those examples to refine this further.
Yep. No, great. Thanks for that, Tyrone. And you're right. I think where something is just clearly gambling, it would just not be eligible as well. So, the current proposal covers that. David Sowery, are you there and unable to mute yourself and just quickly share your question about the degree of interactivity?
Yeah, if you can hear.
Yep.
Basically, my question is about, basically what is it meant by limited interactivity? Because, well, we make like games for like kids, and you're not going to get a toddler to like hold a controller too well and spin around. So we're wondering what actually it was, because it wasn't defined. It was only defined as watching a movie effectively. So I was wondering if you guys had any like inclination on the degree of what meant it was only limited interactivity.
Don't know if anyone on the team wanted to. Well, actually, I'll briefly talk to that. Look, I think it's a great example of an edge case, the type of thing that will come in. Yes, we'll get applications like that, but it makes obvious sense in the context of being educational games. That could be something that during the application process, when you do this initial statement of readiness and the registration, that when your application, they may be able to give you an early indication whether they believe you are eligible or not. But I think that's a great thing to put in a submission as a question to ask. And, look, and our intention here, is to support things which are actually games, but to not support things that are, say, ebooks.
So that's just what I'm.
Cool. We're going to keep moving into what I suspect might be one of the bigger parts of discussion, the actual eligible activities section. I noticed there was a comment talking about job titles and also the fact that people have multiple job titles. But I thought I might just ask this question of V, because it's something we have seen with schemes in other jurisdictions. This is not listed as a list of job titles. What's the thinking behind how the list of inclusions to start with market level remuneration for people and the roles that people have?
So, I mean, in terms of the way that it's defined around activities rather than job titles, I mean, like, obviously if you're looking at a 250K threshold, people more have activities that they do rather than they wear many hats. So trying to define it via job titles becomes incredibly problematic. The other thing that we've seen in the administration of live schemes and the actual evidence is that if you define it around activities, it actually becomes a lot more clearing from an accounting perspective, because you can directly measure into that task list and all that when you're coming to make your claim. Is every single task and every single activity that a game developer does in the course of the production of a game going to be ever included on a list like this? Obviously not. Like, if it's broadly falling under those production categories, you will probably be included. So I think a little bit of common sense here, because if it broadly falls under those categories, and by the same token, you're not going to be doing this whole activity in a vacuum. You're going to have someone to go, hey, look, can I just double check and see if this is eligible or not? Yes, no, and then you can have that discussion. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, so essentially we've tried to avoid the question of what is a job title and is that job eligible? I have a question, and maybe directed for Sarah at MB, but someone phrased it online earlier as, what if my lead game designer is also my lead project manager and also my CEO? But maybe 60% of their time is definitely working on the actual core game itself. Do you want to see their timesheets? So what should we expect in terms of the level of detail?
What can you expect? I think we want to keep this scheme and its administration to a sensible level of complexity. And so ideally, we wouldn't need you to submit timesheets. I think we recognise people wear different hats, as we said, they have different roles. I think we'd welcome your submissions on how we can develop a good process so that you're putting in a reasonable application for the reasonable amount of time. And the scheme is robust. Thanks.
Cool. So I haven't seen any feedback from people saying that there's a particular role within the games industry currently that they feel is excluded from this list, but that's definitely the type of feedback we want from the submissions. One area that probably has been raised in the past is things like community managers and marketing. So certainly those who have an active role in the development of the game and in the project, For instance, bringing feedback from the community that then shapes the future of the game. We wanted them to be included, and things like live operations, ongoing development of the games. We wanted people doing that work to be included. So let us know if anything is missing from the people on this list, or the tasks on this list. Okay, other expenditures which are included. Did anybody have any key questions around the things here that were included, or anything that they feel strongly should be included? Actually, Sam Evans, you posted a comment online earlier about online hosting and distribution, which I think is both in the list of things included here, expenditure in online hosting and distribution of the game. But there's a similar point which is on the list of things that are excluded, expenditure on servers and the rights to access servers. What was your query, Sam?
Sam actually had to step out, it sounds like.
Okay. Look, I think I summarized it. that there's both some servers and hosting included in the inclusions list, and then also some on the exclusions list. And so I think we're looking for advice. So in some of the discussions that we had with MB, things that we want to be included is stuff that you're doing, definitely stuff that you're doing in-house to develop a game. So production servers and so where we have, for instance, the line above that, game production software as a service, game production hardware. So I'm thinking like a build server in-house. We definitely want those to be included. But I think as an example that was given online, you don't necessarily want a $100,000 a month AWS hosting bill to be eligible. Now, we still want the rebate to include not just the in-house development, but also getting it ready to launch. But I think those highly scalable external costs that could possibly blow out of a budget, probably don't want them to be included. Is the intention of the thinking here. But I think we're looking for some good ways to describe that and define that better. Tyrone.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Yeah, this is a tricky one. I think, obviously servers are used for lots of different things in the production of games and the distribution of games, in the live operations of games. I think how you prefaced it before was really interesting and maybe points to how this could be reworded. If most of the intent of the usage of servers is in the production of games, then maybe the language should be focused on that. Any other expenditure, or if there are other activities relating to the production of games or the ongoing live operation of games, maybe that's how it should be defined, because servers can be used for all manner of things, and I imagine every games company that's represented here uses servers in different and quite often nuanced ways that might be hard to separate out. So that's perhaps my thought on how to approach this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. Does anyone have any key questions on the things that are included? And feel free to use the raise hands in Zoom. So on the toolbar at the bottom, there is a reactions tab for many people that you can use to raise your hand if you wanted to.
I've only got one.
Just like that, Anthony, that's how you raise your hand. Anthony, do you have a question about the inclusions?
Yeah, I mean, if the point of the rebate is to, grow high salary jobs in New Zealand, maybe a cap on expenditure for things like servers could be an option, and then it sort of keeps it within the, salaries expenditure rather than external tools and functions, which is money essentially going to other companies overseas, right? Rather than staying in New Zealand.
Yep. Look, you are right. The intention is to support economic activity that happens in New Zealand. But at the same time, we didn't want to rule out things that New Zealand game developers use every day.
Yeah,
so
correct.
For instance,
some
like
sort of
software. Yep.
Cap on that particular type of expenditure might be.
Yep. At this stage, we don't think we're going to spend all of the money in year one. so we're not worried about trying to save money. However, later on we'll talk about reviews after 2 years and 4 years. That's a good suggestion. If we needed to prioritize things, I think a lot of people agree salaries and people is the priority. Anna, did you want to try again?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Fantastic, thank you. I just wanted to raise the point about the market rate salaries. As a small business, we as the directors don't pay ourselves market rate salaries. Does that mean that our salaries expenditure for myself, well, I know mine isn't, but for my husband, who's our lead developer as well, would his salary not be acceptable, eligible because we don't pay him a market rate?
Hey, Lance, as an accountant, can I refer this question to you?
Sure. This really was to stop excessive salaries, not under market. So if you don't pay yourself what you consider a market salary, it's still claimable as long as you pay yourself.
Okay.
That was the intention. It really was just a way to make sure that if there was a hugely successful game, that if salaries were being paid well above market, especially to the owners, that they were not able to be claimed.
Okay, thank you.
Just because it's a follow-on from a comment I made a second ago, Stephen Nicholas has asked in the chat, has there been an assessment of the current level of eligible expenditure? Would the 40 million, which is what's available in the current financial year, less admin, be expensive? It be sufficient? Yes, we believe it would be, and that's based on the annual games industry survey that we do, where we know that we had a bit over 1,000, maybe 1,100 employees in the industry. Multiply that by a nice salary, times it by 20%. Based on last year's size of the industry, we don't believe we would use the full 40 million that's allocated in the first year. However, now that the rebate exists, we fully expect a whole bunch of new studios, new people, and growth to emerge. So we'll see how we go. So we've done the back of the envelope calculation. 40 million is good for year one. However, if it blows out in years 3 or 4, wouldn't it be great if we could carry over any underspend from year 1 into year 2 and year 3, which is, I think, something we'll suggest to the government. But also the application process, the fact that you do a registration is currently proposed before a few, 6 months or even several months before the end of the financial year, should also give the government heads up if there's a risk of blowing the budget. Okay, I have the list of specific exclusions on screen now. Does anyone just want to raise their hand if they had a key question about some of the exclusions here? Actually, Robin, I saw you had a question about expenditure on the use of land and premises.
So other than people, I guess the next best way that a studio can lay roots into New Zealand as an economy is to take multi-year leases in office spaces. I understand that with the hybrid working environment, people do kind of enjoy the flexibility, but specifically excluding that is just wondered why that was specifically excluded, because that money goes right into the New Zealand economy as well. So,
okay. And a note, there's the comment at the top, the expenditure on general business overheads. So, for instance, the people or parts of your business aren't directly making a game, but if your office is probably something that many of us do have. Does anyone else have any comments on that point? There was a discussion question in the consultation document about training and staff development, and whether that should be included or not. Does anyone feel strongly about including training expenses and making them eligible?
So for us at DC, at Digital Confectioners, we think that should be excluded. I also wanted to ask, why has there been an exclusion on expenditure on bonuses to employees? I'm a little bit curious about that, because if, for example, we do PAYE and bonuses through there, we're paying tax on that anyway, and it's part of their compensation package. And so we don't really see it as a big difference between salary and bonuses. And we do currently use bonuses as part of our compensation structure. And they can be quite large. So we're a bit curious as to why that is.
Lance, you had some discussion about that earlier, about discretionary and non-discretionary bonuses.
Sure, I think that discussion was really revolving around the concept I was talking about before, where there is the ability to have very large salaries or bonuses, especially if you're an owner of a business. I think the possible scale of a bonus and being very large, as potentially as James suggested, could be problematic in skewing the claims and possibly blowing them out of the budget we're working with as well over time. But we had to draw a line somewhere where there wouldn't be an excessive claim, and certainly this was based around initial discussions. I think if people have a position on this that they want to put forward, that they should do so through the consultation process.
Yep. Yeah, so for instance, if you have a non-discretionary, well-structured bonus scheme as part of your employment agreements, look, that'd be really useful for us to see in written submissions, if that's something your studio does. And that would also give us assurance that it's not a, as Lance was saying, way for owners to exploit the system. Anthony, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, this is more in relation to the exclusions for general business overheads. I was just wondering why some of those positions are excluded, like human resources, for example, is probably something, that a lot of companies should invest in, and, is kind of integral to a team functioning well and delivering good product too. And recruiting, the right staff that we want to attract to this country, hopefully through this rebate scheme as well. So,
if I can have a moment, so both Sam and I at Digital Convictions, we have a very libertarian view, and so, for example, we don't. We appreciate that there is a rebate, and we see it as necessary because Australia has the rebate and there's a single labour market, and so that's why we see as this is important to have a rebate. But because of that, the way we believe it is that all of these other business expenses, they should be just a business expense. And if the way we said is that if taxpayers know that we're using it for these other purposes, I think it's really hard politically for politicians to continue justifying that, because all other industries and other people would see it as is just that we're getting a handout and that's it. And so that's why we've taken this position of, if it doesn't benefit the taxpayer at the end of the day by us being able to make much better games because we can get better staff and by retaining staff, it's probably not worth it. And every other company also has a human resource expense. They also have legal services. They all have rent, and they all have these things. And so they're going to just say, well, why did these guys get 20% off on those, or 10%, or whatever amount it's going to be? We are the same as them. We are in the same office. We need the same kind of human resources. And so that's why Sam and I at DC have taken that kind of stance.
I'll make a comment, and then I might ask Sarah at MB if you have any policy insight on this. But building on what James said, I view it like labour market distortions. So we've been saying to the government, Australia's done this, and that's distorted how much you can pay game developers in New Zealand. If we then apply the rebate to HR managers and HR expenses in New Zealand, that then starts to distort the price and the cost of doing HR in every business in New Zealand. So it starts to become the spillover impact on other industries, whereas that HR manager might be able to work in a different business but not receive the rebate. But a game developer should always receive the rebate, no matter which business they work in, if they're doing game development. Sarah or the MB team, did you have any further insights on policy intent?
Just to say that just bear in mind the political goals, the policy goals behind the scheme, which is set out in the consultation document. The government is looking to try and build up the sector as a another source of these high wage, low emission exports and economic activity. And some of the comments that have been made here are quite right. You know, a lot of businesses have HR, they have rent, etc. What the government's trying to do is actually spur some growth in this particular industry through the particular unique activities that you do. So I think just bear that in mind in terms of how you think about the eligible criteria here.
Cool. So the things that make us unique and help us create value. Cool. There was a question about bonuses. There was a question about training, and I'd also seen an online comment about intellectual property and the legal fees for that. So that's something to consider, because I think that in general, those are things, developing people, employee ownership and intellectual property, that we do want to encourage. So that might be something that I think in the NZGDA submission, we might look at saying, could we encourage those things? We don't want to, there might be small costs, but we don't want to discourage them. Does anyone have any other burning questions around the specific exclusions? Please raise your hand. Andrew.
It's not about exclusions, but it's a general question. Who determines the market rate for these roles?
So I expect once you make the application, that would be a question you would receive, you know, from the people assessing it, and they'd ask you to prove it. So it's either you've actually paid that, or you can show that that person would receive a similar rate elsewhere.
And how would you prove that? How would you prove that though? Because
can I comment here? I think any arm's length transaction you make with an employee who's not an owner is probably market by default. If that's the cost of employing them, then I think then the question stops there. If it's an owner, I think it gets a little bit more difficult, because you can effectively pay yourself what you can afford to. And that's where I think the discussion is more important to be had. And that's where you probably, as an owner, if you are claiming part or all of your salary in direct production, then you need to be able to justify the rate you're charging it at.
Cool. I am going to keep moving on. On this slide, there was a question which I have seen that's come up about subcontractors and contractors, but there is guidance here suggesting that any rebate claim should be made at the topmost level. So we are trying to accommodate for subcontracting, which does occur in the industry. Question from Anna.
Just a very simple question. The expenditure is taken to exclude GST. So that means when you say 200, the sentence that says for clarity actually makes it less clear. The initial $250,000, that's before GST is added. Is that correct? So it's actually, you've paid out more than $250,000. You've got a share back of that from GST, and then you get a rebate on the rest.
Yes,
thanks.
That's most likely. Yep.
I mean, and the reason for that, of course, is you're going to claim your GST back separately from the government anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, most of this section here is really about no double dipping. If you get coverage from the government elsewhere, then you can't claim it here as well. And that's only fair. And it might be looking at the RDTI, etc., and some other forms of grant that it may be better to drop those and just go with this potentially as well. So you need to assess things globally, but we're trying to have a scheme here that is broad and
workable. Yep.
Yes. Right. Thanks,
Anthony.
This kind of opens up another sort of edge case relating probably more specifically to Cinti than most others, but we sell assets as like an open market kind of thing, right? So other developers, including New Zealand developers, can license those assets. We obviously, if we were in the scheme, we would get the rebate on developing those assets, and then other developers in New Zealand could claim that as an expense and double dip that. Yeah, it's just I don't know. It's just a heads up.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, and Anthony, I was actually thinking that before. Yeah, I mean, I conceptually don't have a problem with you being able to claim and being included, but then I think the flip side of that may be that the studios in New Zealand that have contracted your assets potentially couldn't claim them because you're sort of looking at a double dipping scenario. And I don't know what the answer is going to be here, but I think there needs to be more discussion around this. And because it's quite specialized, I think we probably are best taking it offline.
Yep, that's a good example of an edge case. Let's put on submissions and think about it. Chris Pierce.
Yeah, hi. And hi everyone. I haven't met a lot of you before, but I'm Chris Pierce from Legend Story Studios. One of the questions that we just had around the sort of the broad set of criteria here is, there's obviously a public policy focus here on high wages, low emissions, developing IP for New Zealand, and the concept of weightless exports as kind of key policy drivers. I realise that this policy has come out of a business unit inside MB that has got the word digital in the title, and so the word digital is written pretty heavily all over the document here. But we're a physical games publisher, and a member of the New Zealand Game Developers Association as part of that, and we would argue that as a physical publisher, we meet all those public policy criteria. High wages, low emissions, weightless exports are all key components of our business model as well. And so we were interested to understand why there was a sort of particular focus of the digital aspect of the games industry in this proposal, rather than a broader concept of the games industry all up, including physical gaming.
Yeah. So I think the acknowledgement is, look, yes, the conversation is, it was the digital part of the government that listened to us, is my short answer. And I have a related, other people who are in a similar situation to you have asked the question, what about hybrid games, which are joint physical and joint digital? And I think we have said in the criteria, we have listed hybrid games, am I right? As an example in there, yes. But in that scenario, it would be the digital components of games, of hybrid games.
Yeah, can I just jump in?
Would still be eligible for the activities. But I'm jumping ahead to a second question there. Do you want to respond to the main question, Sarah?
Yeah, just real quick. It's not because of our name that we're focused on digital. We actually, there's trade policy considerations that we have to account for. So physical products that receive a subsidy, you will be in contravention of WTO rules. So we need to focus this support on basically services, digital services. And that's why there's this focus on not a boxed game that you can drop on your foot, but digital.
Yeah, and because your comment, Chris, about IP, scalable IP, you're right, that doesn't necessarily have to be digital in all of its cases. And a lot of the conversations the NZGDA does have with government are around the broader creative industries. There's several creative industries besides gaming that have the opportunity for IP export. And that's something the government should also develop programs for as well.
And so to the extent that this is then services focused rather than goods, do you see opportunities around a services focused definition of what expenditures get included and excluded here?
I think so, because my understanding is you have a lot of digital components to your games.
Well, we have both digital components, and also we're running a multi-million-dollar world circuit of play for our games, involving conventions that happen in 35 different countries around the world, and so that clearly is not a product; it is a service. So, are there elements of those kinds of things that could be considered eligible services?
Yeah, I mean, if they're on that list of eligible expenditure activities, then yes, because we're clear that they are part of a game.
Yeah, I think a line would have to be drawn here, and the business is essentially assessed by bits, and bits that are services and essentially digital could be considered. And I think this is a discussion that needs to be had again, and it's probably quite a big one that I'm going to suggest we take offline. I understand we have a discussion about this next Monday as well. So yeah, hold that here. I'd just like to add as one more sort of variation on this, that games do have to be digitally downloaded. In the old days, you published a game, stuck it in a box and sent it to a retail store. That, like physical games, is excluded because of the WTO rules.
Cool. I'll take a quick question from Kaylin, and then keen to talk about application processes.
Sure. Thanks, Stephen. Just a quick one. Is there like a maximum cap on how much a company can make to be eligible for this grant?
Can make in terms of earn revenue?
So like a super successful company. No, okay.
No. And so, for instance, if Activision Blizzard wanted to set up in New Zealand and they earn $1 billion a year, we would not want to prevent them from that. So no cap on the revenue, but there's a cap currently on how much you can claim of up to 3 million a year. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on to discussing the application process. I hereby predict this call is going to go 5 or 10 minutes over. I just want to check that that's okay. Well, just want to let everyone know that that's the case. The application process has a few different stages in it. And I was wondering, Lance, could you just give us a quick summary of what the current proposed process is?
Yeah, sure. I just want to give a very quick bit of background here. Because there was quite a tight timeline prescribed to put the claim in, we did consider how we might be best to tackle that, especially given that auditors are going to be very busy between 31st of March and probably the end of July, and probably aren't going to be really interested in helping us with what is essentially a small piece of work for them. So we tried to think of a way that we could expedite this process, and that was how we got to discussing breaking it up into various bits, which also have administrative benefits as well. Essentially, the first step is registering your entity and giving an indication of what you do and the scale of your expected claim. That allows the administrator to prepare and essentially in later years possibly also know that they're going to need to prorate the claims back. We've discussed what might be eligible as a business, but certainly wherever that lands, this registration phase will take that into account and essentially say, yes, you're potentially eligible to make a claim. The second step was really to deal with the auditor aspect and also to save costs for studios as well. And what was envisaged there is in the auditor's quieter period, which is probably later in the year, that there'd be a meeting with an auditor to talk about the systems you have in place to track and produce a claim, just make sure that your systems are robust, basically, and an auditor is going to say that you are ready to make your claim in that process. And in doing that and not auditing the actual claim at that time should keep the costs of doing this down. I do note that some people have said that the cost of getting this statement of readiness should be included, and there is probably merit in that discussion, but I'll suggest that people take that into their consultation. The third step will be making the application, and that's going to be online in some prescribed format yet to be made up. To essentially break the claim down into manageable bits so the administrator can understand what they're dealing with, and look at it from a risk perspective as well to get an idea of whether any bits of the claim appear to be unusual or excessive, so they can ask further questions or potentially require a full audit on the claim. And that, of course, is so the government can manage its risk around this to make sure that the scheme doesn't get rorted, which, of course, is in everyone's benefit to do so. So that's probably a quick coverage of that. I don't know if there are any questions that have come out of that, Stephen.
I was going to invite Anna. I know you had some questions and comments about this process.
So I had several questions about this. So I was confused by the statement of readiness versus getting an audit. So the clause that says, in case there is insufficient time for a business to provide an auditor statement, we propose that the business provides a statement of readiness. So I thought, oh, that's something that I can do to say I'm ready for this. But then the next paragraph, it said an auditor's statement verifying that the business has robust practices in place. So I was confused whether it's the business saying we're ready for this, or the auditor saying you're ready for this, but they're not actually doing the audit at that stage. So I found that quite confusing.
Can I answer to these bits as we state them? But my understanding there is that there is required to be some level of external oversight on this, and this is the point where it fell to as that middle step, as opposed to a full audit on the entire claim and its numbers. Was more a sit-down meeting of probably no more than a few hours of time, just to ensure that you are ready and have the processes in place to make a claim. And I'm happy if Sarah wants to add to that, unless she's happy that I've covered it. Cool. Anna.
Okay. What confused me then about the wording was that in case there is insufficient time for a business to provide an auditor statement with their application to verify qualifying expenditures in their claim, makes it sound like that's a necessary part of the process, that you have to have an auditor verify your claim. So is that not the case?
That is a very fair point, and I'd have to say, given that we're now talking 15 working days, you haven't got a hope in hell of getting an audit on your claim. So therefore, maybe we should be thinking about rewording that because it's ambiguous.
Yeah. So the next question was about exactly that. The time frame is just untenable if that's the requirement. I'll
give the government some credit here. They wanted us to get the money as quick as possible after balance date, and that's great. We do want it in our hands. There's a whole other discussion around the timing as well that we may want to have, but it was about expediting it and getting the money out of the government's bank account before the end of June, basically, which is their financial year.
Yeah, right. So questions about the 15 working days. I was also wondering about, are we doing this on a cash basis or an invoice basis? So if we've raised an invoice but it hasn't been paid yet, which year does that fall under?
It's definitely an accrual basis. So it's on an invoice basis, and that 20 working days basically will give time to make sure that we have any end-year invoices in.
Okay, because it says 15 working days. So
yeah, that's not a long period of time. And again, if people feel like that is just a bit too tight, then please make a consultation on that.
Yeah, and if we're going to need to get a statutory declaration as mentioned later, and if we need to get auditor sign off or anything at that point, then that's obviously going to push that out. The next question was, so I watched the webinar yesterday about the DGTO in Australia, and there was a section about borrowing against your rebate or your future rebate. And so the question is, if the fund is oversubscribed and paid out on a pro rata basis, how can we then borrow against it? How will we know? When will we know? Does it mean that we're not going to be able to borrow against our rebate if it's going to be paid out pro rata as notified later?
Right. I've actually spoken to several banks around this already, and to be fair, I think that if you've got a close relationship with your bank, that they will be prepared to cover you in advance for some of this possibly, but it certainly wouldn't be all of it anyway. They're never going to cover 100% of it because they will want to build in some protection for themselves as well, especially because they're not going to know how big your claim will be at end of year either. Yeah, this is a difficult area, and yeah, it's probably a discussion to be taken offline, really. There isn't a mechanism in New Zealand presently to allow us to bring forward the claim by any means of early claim or some type of loaning system or whatever, or something through the tax pooling system. All of these are possibilities, and certainly something that could be brought through consultation and or to our minister as well, if we feel that there's a very problematic side. It's problematic that not having the cash earlier, for example. You're going to discuss this a little bit further on, won't you, Stephen?
Well, let's discuss it now, because this is another area of common feedback we've heard from many studios, the kind of realization that you may, it's a rebate, you may not actually receive the cash, and in hand until June next year. I saw in the chat there was a brief discussion about subsidies versus grants versus rebates. So it's worth realizing this is not a tax incentive. This is not a subsidy. It is a rebate. And the definition of a rebate is you do the activity, you spend the money first. So there's zero risk to the taxpayer. You know, we have generated jobs and spending in New Zealand. And then after the activity has been incentivized to happen, then you get to claim for it. So that also just done politically, when you hear people talking about, oh, there's a subsidy for game development or there's a tax incentive, that is incorrect. This is a rebate that you get back after you have spent. So yeah, that timing issue is a concern that many studios have raised. Is there a way to get it earlier or take a loan against it so that your bank could support you to get those funds earlier? So I think we're open. Well, I'm really interested to hear from people who have proposals on how we could make that work and presumably still work for New Zealand On Air and MB who have to administer a scheme like that. Tim, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, just around a solution to that. So to remember, I'm with EY, so I'm not a game studio, but I've been working in grants and incentives for the last 15 years. I think the R&D incentive has just launched an in-year payment scheme here, which is actually run through Tax Management New Zealand and funded by MB. The pre-registration statement of readiness and application process is in effect very similar to the R&D pre-approval process. So I don't see any reason why the funding, in-year funding, couldn't be provided for this scheme in a very similar mechanism. But again, that's another MB program which they're working through at the moment. So maybe, Sarah, you've talked to the team already on that, but there's potential opportunity for overlap there.
Yep, and that's a good example, and we've looked at that one as well. So there are some precedents and some similar neighbouring schemes.
Yeah, just I guess the difference with this is that you've got a 40 million envelope and you've got to stay within that somehow. And so if you introduce within year payments, you start introducing also a bit more complexity about, well, what happens if you hit it? Do you reclaim money back from people if you've ended up overpaying at the end of the year, etc.?
Yeah, well, the R&D loan scheme still works as it is just a loan with the company. So even if the company gets no R&D credit at the end, they still have to pay the loan back because the loan is separate to the R&D incentive, but it's a mechanism that allows access during the year. The other comment I'd just make is simplifying the expenditure calculation makes these schemes so much more workable for everybody. We were involved in the R&D incentive process, and one of the policy processes 4 or 5 years ago, one of the ideas we threw to government was just make it salary plus a general overhead uplift. Make it really simple so that from a compliance and an audit and a certification process, it's really simple. So it could simply be labour plus a standard overhead, pick 10%, 15%, 20%, whatever we think is reasonable for the sector, plus contractors with no uplift. Something like that makes it really simple for everybody. It takes away so much dispute and makes it operationally really easy. My final comment I'll make is the question around who claims, organisation A or B or C, where there's contractors and principals, really important. That's got to be solved. Otherwise, you'll end up with 2 or 3 or 4 organisations who all contract to each other, trying to claim the same dollars, and it's really hard to get visibility of that.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Those are good comments. I'm going to start winding up the conversation at this point, unless anyone wants to raise their hand with something critical.
I'd just like to reiterate that the rebate is intended to be non-taxable. There are different types of rebates and grants out there, but the advice that's been taken on this is that it will be a non-taxable rebate for us, which makes it more valuable. Certainly keeps it closer to the Australian scheme in that respect. I'll also add that we've had quite a few discussions around somehow getting access to some funds earlier, especially on the basis that the government has responded to what is effectively an emergency for some studios that are struggling to to hire and retain people because of the offers coming out of Australia. That is certainly something front of mind, and we are looking at various options for that, and our ministers are open to these discussions as well, so that they will be had. They will be taken directly to the minister as well, and I think the NZGDA will have a submission to our minister on this as well, which I think will probably be in a position to share with others as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that, Lance. Hey, well, I'll start. One last question, go for it, and then I will draw things to a close.
So there's a conversation going on in the chat at the moment that I just wanted to quickly raise. So just touching on the 75% revenue or previous revenue coming from the games industry criteria
to be considered an eligible business. Yep.
Yeah. If you're a studio that haven't released their first game yet and you're funding the development through other channels outside of the game industry, then you wouldn't qualify.
Yep, I think that's a good observation. Yep.
Yeah, so that I think needs to change because that I feel would be a bit unfair.
Yep, and I see there's some good conversation in the chat, kind of challenging the applicability of that 75% or that primary thing. So yeah, let's all consider that. And that's again a great example in your written submissions. If that's your case that your business is in, write a submission. Show the government that businesses like that exist, and that this rule would have an impact on your business.
Sure. Okay.
Well, essentially, you're a startup in this position, and if you're only doing a game and haven't monetized it yet, then I don't think it's anybody's intention that you don't have a claim. You've incurred costs.
Yep.
And this is about subsidizing your costs effectively.
Yep. Right, but you wouldn't qualify because you wouldn't have drawn 75% of your income from the games industry. You'd drawn it from some other industry.
Yep.
You mean you've had another trading business that you've been monetizing before?
That's the case he's talking about. Yep, and you're right. We want to encourage startups and people who are bootstrapping through other businesses. We do want to encourage those. So yeah, I think NZGDA will certainly in our submission reconsider the 75% guideline.
Yeah, like even if you bootstrap yourself, like I did when I started my business, I just put my own money in. If that wouldn't qualify, then it doesn't really encourage, the start of new business, I suppose.
Yep. Great. Hey, thank you, everybody. I'm just going to make a quick comment about scheme governance. It's the last section that the consultation is looking for feedback on. So do consider that. Do think about that. One thing it mentions is that the Industry Advisory Board for the Digital Technologies Industry Transformation Plan is involved in the governance. What you should know is that the chairperson of the NZGDA is on that board. So there is a link between the industry association and that governance. Feel free to consider if you think that should be stronger or weaker or different. So, hey, look, thank you very much. As I said, we didn't get the chance to answer every comment and every question in the chat, but we will make sure that we copy them and record them. So we'll collate all those questions. It's our goal as the association to share our submission with you a week or a few days, certainly before the deadline. So you can either tell us whether you agree or disagree, or if you want to repeat and reinforce things in your own submissions, you are welcome to. But really one of the goals of today was to encourage people to be prepared, to have thought through some of the issues, how it affects you, and for you to put forward submissions. So the MB and government teams, can work with us to design a scheme that works for everyone and just helps grow the entire games industry. So if you haven't already, certainly do join the NZ Game Dev Slack channel. I'll post the link again in the code in the chat window if you're not already a member of that Slack community. And certainly, if you feel strongly about particular topics, I know there's some of you that we're actually going to that we've arranged meetings to actually talk through some of those specific edge cases and how it applies to your business. Look, reach out to any of the board members who are here, or just email info@NZGDA. We're keen to continue this conversation. Both the NZGDA and then also the MB teams are keen to hear from you as well. So yeah, thank you very much, everybody, for your time today. It's a really exciting milestone for our industry, and we're keen to get everyone's input and get it right.